Okay, we're gonna give everybody like another minute to log in and for your to get settled and then. You're on the Zoom, we're giving everybody about 1 more minute so we get logged in.
This is true.
Okay. Or the camera is, but thank you for coming tonight to our annual funding forum here at Marin County Office for Education. We are excited to introduce Mike Klein, who has been the executive director of FICMAT since 2017. And prior to that, has a long career in education as an interim superintendent, deputy assistant superintendent of business, so he's seen both sides of the house, and has degrees in, I believe, accounting as well as public administration. So we are very excited to have him here once again. He has been a regular attendee at this event, and we will also be posting his slides after the event, as well as we'll be recording this tonight. So keep that in mind as you ask questions, even though this is a group, I believe it was superintendents and CBOs who were invited to this, as well as internal Marin County Office of Education staff. So thank you for coming, and we will be doing Q&A after the presentation. So we will be able to get anybody who is in the Zoom. Please go ahead and post your questions in the chat, and I will be asking those after Mike is finished with the presentation. But thank you. We appreciate you coming tonight. This was fine.
Good evening, everybody.
Good evening.
Good evening.
You probably don't, I have a big mouth, but I need a microphone for the folks on Zoom, so bear with me here. Especially the folks on Zoom, bear with me as I move the microphone right here. My pleasure to join you again for what is probably the 5th, 6th year or so. As some of you have been here that whole time, remember that my friend and colleague Brooks Allen we used to do this together. John has not bribed Brooks and I with any gifts like Mary Jane used to. And that's an inside story. She sent us pink tutus one year so that the two of us could wear matching outfits up here. Obviously we didn't, although we have them. I'm sure Brooks kept his, just like mine. But we were never invited to a Mary Jane retirement party, which is where we were going to wear them. So anyway, I'm going to talk to you about the governor's budget, and at this point, it's kind of old news, right? It's been out for almost 3 weeks, so you've had a chance to absorb it, which in some respects is really good, because we can talk about some of the nitty gritty and some of the hot issues as opposed to just some of the core pieces of it. But for those of you that haven't focused in on it, I will walk through it, but I'm going to do it fairly rapidly. It's also, frankly, for us nerds that deal with this every day, this is a bit of a boring budget, except for a couple key, very technical items. And we'll get into that because those are obviously are going to be hot issues. So I want to set the stage, though, and remind you all where we started this December, and that was with the Legislative Analyst's Office, actually a month late delivering their fiscal outlook, and they did it at the CSBA conference right down the freeway in San Francisco on a Friday morning. They, at that point, identified a $68 billion state budget deficit for the budget window. We're going to refer to the budget window quite a bit, so I want to make sure we kind of understand that. It's probably important to understand the context. The budget window for this discussion is 2022-23 last year, 23-24 this year, and 24-25 next year. We call next year the budget year, current year, prior year, and so on. It's a 3-year window, but some of the forecasts we're looking at are actually 6 years. They go out much further, although that's not the focus of the governor's proposal. Locally, when we talk about 3 years, we're always talking about current year plus 2 years. So it's always gonna be 3 years, but it's a different 3 years, and that's important for us to kind of understand that context, okay? And it's super important to understand this 3 years, because all the changes that are driving some of the decisions here, all the issues that are driving some of the decisions here are actually, most of them are actually in the prior year, in 22-23. Okay? For all of us, 22-23's gone, right? We've closed our books. Your audits are already due. If you don't have them, they're past due. All that good stuff. So 22-23 is done for all of us, but for the state, it's not. And that creates one of the dilemmas that we're needing to deal with. In the LAO's forecast, they indicate that we're looking at about $58 billion of lower revenue. The governor acknowledges a lower revenue as well, but not quite as much, and we'll talk about that. And then Prop 98 in the LAO's mind, because of all the dynamics, jumps between the 3 tests, test 1, test 2, test 3. It actually goes 1, 3, 2. I'm not going to get into the Prop 98 tests. Those are highly technical. However, they have a bearing as we look out in the future on what funding will be. But most important for you to understand when somebody's talking to you about the Prop 98 test is you're always going to be in the test that gives you the most money as a system. So if we move to test 2, because revenues have dropped quite a bit, ADA's dropped and all that, test 2 will still be better than if we stayed in test 1, okay? Test 1, we're going to focus on after this slide. We're only going to focus on test 1 because the governor suggests that we're only going to be in test 1 during this window. And of the tests, test 1's the simplest. It's just a straight percentage of state tax revenues. Schools and colleges, K-14, so not the UC or the CSU, but schools and community colleges get about 39%. We usually round it and just call it 40% of the big 3 taxes. Okay. Cost of living adjustment for the LAO set this number at 1.37. Really doesn't make any difference what they estimated out or what the governor estimates out. It's an actual calculation. And at the time this data was put together, and the governor's data that we're going to look at in just a minute was put together, we had 6 of the 8 data points to do the calculation. Today we have 7 of the 8 data points. In the last data point, or the 7th data point, was released last Thursday. It will get revised at the end of February. And then the 8th data point doesn't come to us until April. We'll talk more about that in a second. So moving from that expectation, things were pretty grim, right? They set the stage for things to be pretty grim. And the governor then comes out, this is a constitutional deadline, the January 10th deadline is constitutional. When we get into updates, such as the May revise, that's a statutory deadline, but January 10th is a constitutional deadline. And so when the governor came out on January 10th with his proposals for the new fiscal year that starts July 1, he hit on a number of key pieces. The trend for the most part is identical to the LAOs, but the numbers are not. And we're going to go take a deeper dive on all of these. But the first thing that I want to point out on this slide is really the last bullet point, because we're going to take a deeper dive on the rest of these. Maintains prior investments and priorities with only natural reductions. And that's for schools and colleges. So he proposes really no significant reductions at all, despite the state's fiscal condition with respect to revenues. Okay. And we'll talk about some of those. We may see that come to light. We may see the legislature change that approach here in the coming months. So let's start with revenues, because revenues drive everything else, right? Prop 98 is a percentage of state revenues, so whatever revenues are, that's what drives the available funds for Prop 98. First is general fund revenue, and the governor's proposal is down $43 billion. $58 billion for the LAO, 43 for the governor. Now, $15 billion you're going to see on a later slide, and we're going to spend a few minutes talking about that difference of $15 billion you're going to see come up, and we're going to talk about that a little bit. It is spread across these three taxes, and we call these the three big taxes. There are lots of other taxes. There's cigarette tax. There's all of your favorite tax at the fuel pump, gasoline tax, right, under SB 1 and so on. But those are special taxes, right? The gas pump tax goes to transportation issues. These three taxes are general unrestricted taxes, and these are what influence Prop 98. So personal income tax is the largest of them, about 65% among the three here. Corporate taxes and sales and use tax, okay? So personal income taxes are down just about 30 billion in the governor's proposal, 21 of which is from 2022. And why are we talking about taxes being down in 2022 when we're in 2024, right? And you all remember that we deferred, the state followed the IRS's deferral for 55 of the 58 counties here in California that may have had some impact from last winter's extremely wet weather and floods. And the idea was to give taxpayers impacted by that, those natural disasters more time to file their taxes. So they deferred the April 15 tax deadline, initially to October, and then they extended another month to November, okay? And what do we do in April of 2023? We true up our taxes from 2022, right? So that's why 2022, while it seems so long ago, the reality is that's what we would have worked on last April when we all had our initial tax deadlines. They were extended, so we didn't deal with what really was attributable to 22 until November, okay? I'll go ahead and make my commentary on this now. First off, the biggest single variance here are from our 1%ers. And maybe one or two of them were impacted by the floods. But for the most part, they weren't impacted by the floods. That's number one. And number two, we knew where they were, but there was a reason not to acknowledge what taxes they owed, because it gave, in my opinion, it gave the governor and the legislature an opportunity to use an inflated revenue going into this year. Okay, but we now are paying the consequence of that by needing to acknowledge all of this. The 1%ers, you know, or the 1% earners, there's 181,000 tax filers in the state of California that fall into that 1% category. They contribute just under 50% of the total personal income tax. They're also different than probably most of us. Most of us pay our taxes monthly in our paycheck through withholding, which has actually been growing, which is a good sign for our economy. Most of these people pay estimated taxes quarterly. Okay, and that's important because, don't let me forget this, not on the slide, because we already have January's estimated taxes from the 1%ers, and I want to make sure I share that with you. The biggest single influencer of their tax liability is their investment earnings in the equity markets. And it doesn't take, frankly, it doesn't take an economist to say the equity markets in 2022, you know, we're doing so well. I have a particular budget technical term that I usually use, but I won't use it. I'm trying to be respectful here. But it doesn't take a rocket science to figure that out, right? The reality is they didn't have anything to pay in April. And when the tax filing got extended to the October, they didn't have anything to pay. And when it finally came due in November, they didn't have any tax liability to pay. It's not that they're all late. These are folks that actually pay their tax, for the most part, with a few exceptions, pay their taxes on time because the interest and penalty on what they usually owe is so large, right? But they do pay it at the last minute, okay? The last possible day is when they wire the money. So understand that we have this issue about their, what we call capital gains, which are the taxes on their, on most of their equity holdings, okay? Corporation insurance tax is down, but sales and use tax is up. And it's up in part because of inflation, right? When we go to the grocery store, we pay sales tax. We go to the hardware store and we pay sales tax. Everything costs more. The tax is a percentage of the bill. And so it is up in part because of it. Capital gains for those 1%ers, or capital gains for any of us, but the big contributors here are the 1%ers. Peaked in 2021 at about 11.6% of the personal income tax. This year in the forecast going forward, we're using 5%. So it is the most significant portion of the drop. Okay. Neither the governor or the LAO assume a recession in their revenue forecast. They both assume some moderate economic growth. Okay. Moderate could be a term of art here. Especially when we look at fourth quarter data that we now have, fourth quarter from last year that we now have that we didn't here. So in fact, let me speak to that. The governor in this forecast on January 10th, and understand that forecast was put together back in early December. But we already have January's estimated taxes. January's just finishing up right tomorrow. But the estimated taxes for the 1%ers was due on the 16th. And we know that we're about $4 billion short from what was estimated on January 10th. Okay, so the first tax payment after the governor's forecast is already about 4 billion short. Okay. All right, overall state budget shortfall projected at 38 billion. However, the governor proposes some solutions that total 43 billion. We are still uncertain why those numbers are different between 38 and 43. He's proposed more solutions than what would apparently be needed. That's unusual. We don't know if they've messed something up in their calculation, if they're just not sharing what the difference is, but that difference is still a little bit of unknown to us. The governor proposed some spending related solutions, some with reserve withdrawals, including for schools, and some cost shifts and a small amount of additional revenue, actually, of the 4.4 billion, 4 billion in cost shifts and 400 million in revenue. So minor revenue. The 30 billion difference between this 38 billion and the LAO's 68 billion, a lot of people are making a lot about that number. But when it boils down to what their difference is, it's about 15.3 billion, and it's all in revenues. Okay. And 10 billion of it's related to Prop 98. However, that's a philosophical difference between how the LAO counts it and how the governor counts it. So, you know, they just have different approaches. And the rest of it is in points of comparison. What month are they starting to count from? Or what month and what year are they starting to count? Okay, so this is what we want to pay attention to. This is the risk in the revenue budget, at least that's been quantified for us. What I would tell you is this when I say the risk here, that we could actually have lower revenues closer to the LAO, but who's to say the LAO is right? Could be lower than that, because we're certainly not starting out very strong, right? With January being off 4 billion. So we're already basically a third of our way here, counting January. Okay. I'll tell you now, and I'll repeat it at the end. This is a number locally you need to be sensitive to, because you need to figure out what the impact would be to you if revenues drop and they were to make cuts, as opposed to some other trickery. Okay. Deferrals wouldn't be a cut, but they'd be able to address that change in revenue with deferrals. Additional drawdown of the rainy day fund could offset part of that difference. But just so you know, the calculation for schools of this 15.3, because of some complexities in Prop 98 involving a spike factor, an anti-spike factor that is part of the calculation. It's just over 4 billion, this Prop 98 share, this 15, and we've got 5.8 billion kids. So you just divide it. So we're talking about somewhere between 80 and 90 bucks per student risk, this 15 billion risk is. So just factor that in. If you're in a district that has $80 to $90 per student in reserves, with no issue, no concern, then that risk factor is probably not something you're gonna worry about, okay? The chances of it actually making a cut is anybody's guess, because they do have other tools available to them to deal with the revenue drop. And the governor was pretty clear about that on January 10th. He acknowledges this is a risk, but he also acknowledges he did not use all the tools in the tool chest in January in his proposal, okay? Sorry, 2 slides. I think I have my slides memorized here. But I didn't, there we go. So one of the ways the governor deals with the shortfall for schools, that Prop 98, whether it's basically the $14.3 billion shortfall for schools. One way he deals with that is to make a discretionary withdrawal from the public school system stabilization fund. Okay, this is the Prop 2, this rainy day funds that Governor Brown negotiated with CTA and some other partners. There are a number of different rainy day funds in the state budget now that we didn't have in the past. One of them is for schools and colleges, and this is this particular one. We were estimating a balance by the end of 24-25 of about just under $11 billion in that fund. Now that 24-25, but because revenues are lower in 22-23 and 23-24, we won't have to make as many deposits to the fund because it's formulaic. Prop 2, when we all voted on that, changed the Constitution. It put the formulas for these savings account, both the deposits, the establishment, the deposits, and the withdrawals, all in the Constitution. Okay, and so with lower revenues, we won't need to make the originally forecasted deposits. They'll be much smaller. And at this point in time, based on the numbers, there is not a formulaic withdrawal from the savings account. We don't meet the conditions for that formulaic withdrawal. But the governor can make a discretionary withdrawal by declaring an emergency. And he told us on January 10th that he will do that, but he will do it after the legislature weighs in on their agreement basically with the overall plan. And there's some politics in that, and there's some control in that. To declare the emergency now would allow the legislature some freedom to do some other things that he doesn't want them to have. So he's going to wait till they've agreed to a deal on the budget in June, and then he'll do mechanically and legally what he needs to do to make it happen. And that would be declaring a budget emergency. Okay. He intends to make a $5.7 billion withdrawal in total, $3 billion this year and $2.7 billion next year. Sorry. Excuse me. All right. It's important to note that he doesn't tend to take it all out at once, which is actually contrary to what the Legislative Analyst's Office suggested. And that may change. We'll see what the mix of solutions the legislature is interested in. But by taking $3 billion out this year, that leaves a balance at the end of this year of about $5.7 billion, which leaves your local reserve caps in place. If you were to take the whole thing out this year, you wouldn't have local reserve caps next year. Now, those should not be a practical issue for any of you. If it is, you need to speak to me, because there's simple legal ways to work around this. But it is a political issue, and it's a face-saving issue for CTA. Okay, they don't want to abandon the reserve caps unless they have to. And they fully understand that, practically speaking, they can be worked around. Okay. So of the 14.3 billion problem, he proposes filling part of it, 5.7 of it, by this use of the savings account. It leaves just under $4 billion in the savings account. What I tell you a minute ago about a 15.3 billion difference between the LAO and the governor's revenue forecast is worth about $4 billion to schools. He could solve that problem by making an additional withdrawal. Okay, so it doesn't necessarily mean a cut to us. Okay, Continuing on with Prop 98. Prop 98, we've been talking about this 14.3 problem. The governor assumes we're in test one across the budget window, so we're just getting a straight percentage. So as revenues drop, we drop basically 40 cents. Every dollar that revenues drop, 40 cents drop for us, okay? We are rebench, this number includes the rebenching, which is a technical term in Prop 98. All that means is for new programs that are coming into Prop 98, we have a deal, long held understanding and interpretation of law that basically says we will not put new programs in Prop 98 that then are a claim to Prop 98. That the only way we put new programs in there is to take the funds from the non-Prop 98 side and move them over to the Prop 98 side. And we call that rebenching. We reset the Prop 98 levels. So the continued expansion of universal kindergarten and the Prop 28 arts and music money both are rebenching activities. Okay. Prop 28 is 931 million or so, and the expanded TK is I've forgotten the number, 600 and almost 700 million if I remember. So a little over $1 billion, $1.5 billion or so between those two. So to solve this problem, we've just talked about the savings account. The second piece of the governor's proposed solution here is what we call $8 billion in trickery. We're trying not to use the word manipulation because frankly, they could just cut us by $8 billion. And the governor didn't propose doing that, right? But there's no question that this will require a change in the law. And the governor says that, proposes statutory changes to count this $8 billion that we received last year based on a projection of higher revenues that didn't come in, and thus we wouldn't have been funded to account for that differently. Okay. Some would say take it and run. Others are more purists about 98 and say, no, you gave us the $8 billion, it's now in our base, and future funding needs to be built upon on top of that. Okay, and that's the offset here. You know, how pure do we want to be? We want to consent to those changes in Prop 98, like any of us in this room have any say about it. But our labor partners do. Because historically, either school board members or teachers sue the state over manipulations of Prop 98. And I can tell you from my conversations with CTA, they are not on board yet with this $8 billion. They understand the benefit, but they also understand this goes against Prop 98 as written, and it goes against their most recent deal with the administration over what we call certification of Prop 98. And that deal's not very old, a couple years. And so they're raising that as a concern. They haven't come out, I think, publicly and said yay or nay, but they're still working through it. Basically, what the governor's proposed that happen here is this $8 billion, and we need to pause for a moment, I guess, and think about what would have happened had we not had the tax filing deferral last April. In May, we would have known we were off by $8 billion. Yeah. And they would have cut us because they don't over appropriate Prop 98. Philosophically, they just simply, that's not where the legislature or the administration, either any legislature or any administration have ever been since 1988. They don't over appropriate it. Okay, so they would have cut us. So in some respects, we probably could count our blessings for the tax deferrals, even though they've caused this, problem for us. Okay, so the first choice is the governor could simply take the $8 billion back. He could claw it back, which would be pretty detrimental because we closed our books for last year, right? We've spent the money, so clawing it back all at once or over time would be problematic. Okay. And there are a whole host of other things they can do. So the CBOs in the room understand this very clearly, and that is that some of the money they owed us last year isn't paid to this year. We call that the P2 apportionment, right? Well, the P2 apportionment that was paid to us in the fall was a little over $7 billion. They could just call that 23-24 funding instead of 22-23 funding, and their $8 billion problem goes away. And we're all left sitting here with $8 billion less money. Because they're just gonna, what we call score or attribute that payment from this fall that's actually scored to last year, they just score it to this year. Very, very simple little thing they have to do, okay? And it would mess up all of our revenue calculations locally, okay? So what the governor proposes doing is us keeping the 8 billion, but so it's not an over appropriation in 98, he's gonna go back and call it a non-98 appropriation to schools. So he takes it out of the 98 window. Okay, and he's going to score it because the non-98 side of the budget can't afford an $8 billion hit last year. He's going to score it to the non-98 side over 5 years starting next year. And amortize this to the non-98 side. Now, what you need to know about the non-98 side, we shall be grateful when we work in the 98 side, because the non-98 side is taking all the cuts. And with this move by the governor, they're taking an extra $8 billion worth of cuts. And what you have to understand for the governor and for the legislature is they have a lot of priorities in the non-98 side of the budget. All their climate priorities, all their unhoused citizens or population priorities are there. Law enforcement priorities, fire priorities, prisons, which aren't a big deal right now because nobody's in prison, right? They let everybody out. And so costs for prisons actually are declining quite a bit and so on. So just know that politically, we may see the legislature object to this. Okay. Kim, you heard a little bit of that. Kim, a couple of weeks ago, had the opportunity to spend the weekend with the budget architects from the governor's office and Department of Finance and LAO and Senate and budget and Senate and Assembly staff. And they kind of hinted a little bit at that risk, right? Okay. Continuing on with Prop 98, there are some small enhancements in Prop 98. We will see later this week the trailer bill language associated to all of these. So we'll have a much clearer idea what they intend to do with all these, plus the next slide on the program revisions. That trailer bill is due by Friday, and so it'll start to come out here in the next 14 hours and then on through Friday. The first one is new literacy screening for TK through 2. We call it K2 because the state still considers kindergarten a 2-year, 1-grade program. So they refer to it as K2, but it actually starts with kindergarten. This is the research that was funded on dyslexic screening a couple years ago. We call it literacy screening. Mary Jane Burke, former county superintendent, has actually been working for the State Board of Ed and UC University.
Yes.
Thank you. On this particular item, and so will increase the block grant. They are going to create a third rate. Right now, there's an elementary and a secondary rate in the block grant. They're going to create a K2 rate because they're not going to fund this for K6 when the screener is for K2. We have a new math framework. This is a small amount of professional development money for that. We'll see the other piece of it in just a second. Some research and study into student level attendance data at the state. Today, you all have student level attendance data, and we know what chronic absenteeism at the state is on a student level data, but we don't do apportionments or funding on a student level. We roll that up, ADA is rolled up to per grade span per district, okay? Some additional infrastructure and additional investment in the college guidance initiative, really just to take it out to 29. It expires next year. They would like to continue it until 20. There are a variety of others. These are the bigger dollar ones, and what's important here when I say bigger dollars, you can see these are all small dollars. If we look at past years when we make big dollar investments, they're in the 500 million billion dollar investments, so you can see that these are relatively small. Okay. Program revisions, so we're continuing to implement universal TK, adding, moving the birth dates out another 2 months, which will add about 51,000 ADA. This is why we see growth in kindergarten grade, because otherwise we see declines in kindergarten. Okay, but the reason we see growth across the state is because of UTK implementation. It continues the ratio, dropping the ratio to 10-to-1 beginning 25-26. It of course is 10-to-1 already if you have 4-year-olds in your TK classrooms. But for all TK classrooms, 10-to-1 with no additional funding to do that proposed at this point. Statutory changes on student attendance recovery. So this is some of the draft trailer bill that we'll see this week that we're anxious to see. This expands Saturday school opportunities, and I expect this week, based on some conversations I've had, that we will see a provision for those of you operating ELOP, Extended Learning Opportunities Program, after school programs, that you'll be able to take some of that time paid for with ELOP funds and make up absences for students and thus generate ADA. And the way that would be done is if a student, this is just my example, student misses Friday, on Monday, they could spend an hour with a certificated employee. So if your ELOP doesn't have certificated employees, you'll have to put a certificated employee in it for this purpose. And that's a perfectly legit cost for ELOP. You may not be able to afford it, but it's perfectly eligible cost. And then they would have to cover the material the student didn't get on Friday. So it can't just be an art teacher coming into ELOP and spending an hour with the student. It would need to be, if they didn't on Friday, if they missed ELA and math and social studies, that's what would have to be covered for. Okay, they could spend an hour on Monday, they could spend an hour on Tuesday, they could spend an hour on Wednesday and one on Thursday. Now we're up to the minimum day, and you'd be able to add those hours together from an ADA perspective and recover the absence on Friday from both an ADA standpoint, but in the state's mind, more important than the ADA, because they actually are assuming very small dollars for this. More important than the ADA is what they call the instructional continuity, making up the instructional loss, the time loss, number one. And number two, it would wipe that absence out of chronic absenteeism data, okay? So it makes it up from that perspective as well, okay? So we'll see some of that in trailer bill language this week. New arts and music CTE credential. This is important to implement Prop 28 for many of you across the state. I don't think it's any different here in Marin. For your elementary schools, many of our community partners are who provided arts and music, right? Symphonies, community orchestras, Art Alliance, Art Foundations, those guys provided volunteers, right? That delivered a lot of that instruction under a teacher supervision. Well, under Prop 28, you can't spend your money on them. I mean, you can't, a small piece, you have to spend 70%, right? 80, I don't know why all of a sudden the number went out of my head. 80% of your Prop 28 money has to be on staff, depending on the size of the school, okay? And so this would allow those community folks to get a CTE credential. Okay? Because CTE and adult ed credentials are based on experience, not necessarily based on education or the education of education type of thing. We would be doing away with the basic skills assessment for new teachers, which I think is the right thing to do. They would instead, if you have a degree, it would count towards that. But I'm old enough to remember why we put CBEST in place to start with, and that's we had people with degrees in classrooms that didn't have basic skills. So, or at least they couldn't seem to articulate those basic skills. So, but we've been waiving part of this during the pandemic to start with. So this is a teacher pipeline issue. Same with single subject, instead of taking the test, they would do a transcript evaluation. Got enough units in those single subjects, you probably would follow. Okay, the final piece of this is some changes to the Learning Recovery Block Grant, the unallocated funds. These are the $7.1 billion of funds from last year, all of which was funded, but then it's been clawed apart at all but 1.3 billion of it has been clawed back. And they're now going to pay that over the next 3 years, not next year, starting in 25, 26 over 3 years. When those funds are paid back, there'll be some new rules on how you can use those funds. We'll have to wait and see what Trailer Bill says about it, but we know that one of the areas they want to bring focus to is the new math framework. They'll explicitly say you can use those funds on professional development related to the new math framework. Because remember the slide a minute ago, it's going $20 million, and that doesn't go here. Okay. All right, deferrals and reductions. We only have one cut, and we have one deferral. Both of these are outside of Prop 98, but for schools. So last year, the governor proposed 2.7 billion or 2.5 billion in school facility money because of the most recent state bond had dried up, and we had projects in the pipeline, but no funds in the pipeline. Understand that when we hit that milestone where we have no funds to allocate out, then you can all develop a level 3. Wow, levy and level 2 together, I'm really struggling. You can all levy level 3 developer fees. And that's a super sensitive issue. Okay, so why did the governor put $2.5 billion in non-98 into school facilities? Is so there was money in the treasure chest, and you didn't hit the milestone to be able to levy level 3 developer fees. So he needs to keep some money there. Otherwise, he opens that door up for all of you, okay? And so he does propose moving the originally planned 875 by cutting it by $500 million to 375. There's some logic in that. There are 375 million roughly projects ready to go. So instead of overfunding, he's funding exactly what they have in the pipeline, and he's committing to a November 24 school bond, statewide school bond. We still have to work through the details of the amount and who will be included. And when I say who, whether UC and CSU will be included or not. They don't poll well. People don't like bonds, but if you don't, bonds for them, but if you don't do them, then their facilities come out of the general fund, right? The non-98 side of the general fund. So it's a problem. So he leaves enough there to accomplish the purpose. The 550 million for full day K, TK, and preschool facilities was originally funded. It was deferred from this year to next. He proposes deferring it again one more year. So not a cut, but a deferral. Okay, what will ultimately be 2 years later. Okay. So looking ahead, we could have skipped all this, except it's good background for you, and focus just on this in the next slide, really. So looking ahead to 24, 25, and certainly the out years, flat revenue growth over the next several years with risks to the revenue forecast. So we talked about that. And it's not just the forecast, but it's what tests were in Prop 98. As revenues drop more, then the mathematical equations in the Constitution would move us into a test 2 or test 3 environment. Remind you all that test 1 doesn't factor, it's just a straight percentage. Like I said earlier, it doesn't factor in ADA. Test 2 and test 3 take ADA into consideration. And we have dropped significant ADA in the state in the last several years, some 300,000 students. So that number will be quite a bit lower, no matter what. Low to normal COLAs. Everybody's freaking out about the COLA, right? Being low, and if I were you, I'd be freaking out too. So that's fair. But this COLA is in the more normal range than what we've been experiencing. This year's 8.22 is high. Last year's 13.5, whatever it was, 13 more than that. I've already forgotten the number, was record setting, right? So a normal COLA is in that 2 to 3.5%, 4% range. 0.76 is the COLA that the governor is using. We were asked to estimate COLA last November and we did that and published it, and it was 0.77. So I have to say Department of Finance isn't too far off. But let me give you what the assumptions were. It assumed no economic growth in the fourth quarter that we just ended in December. And it assumed no economic growth in the first quarter that we're in right now, up through March. So it just took the economic growth from third quarter and left it flat over the last 2 quarters of the 4-quarter calculation, okay? We now have fourth quarter data. And it was not a dramatic amount of growth, but it was a small amount of growth. When we plug that number into the COLA calculation, it would come out to 0.87. So just a slight increase, but then that calculation assumes no further economic growth in the first quarter. It would go up to about 1.2 if we had a 1% growth in gross domestic product in the first quarter. So just to give you a reference point, it's not going to get back to where you all want. It may go up a hair or so, but it's not going to get to what most of you probably used at first interim, which is 3.94 for next year, because that was the last published number in June. Okay, and we've known since it was published it wasn't a good number. Again, doesn't take an economist to figure that out. It just was out of line. Okay, so know that we're going to be dealing with some lower to more normal COLAs. They look abnormal because they're following some very high COLAs. Okay, so think about that if you're still open in negotiations with deals on the table that haven't been accepted yet for this year. Think about that. You want to get everybody back to the table and deal with reality. And you probably are going to get a quick deal because I think our folks on the generally speaking on the other side of the table. I hope you're not sitting across the table from each other, but you all know what I'm talking about. I'm starting to see some deals that have been sitting there for months starting to close, basically. Declining enrollment continues in all regions of the state during the pandemic. We had a dramatic decline in enrollment, but we had some regions that it didn't touch. We actually had regions of growth. This is not to say that every district's declining and every county's declining, but every region of the state is now declining. But we are at a more normal rate of decline that we forecasted. This is not going to change in the near term. We actually have declines forecasted out for the next 25 years. Okay. The number one reason for the decline in enrollment is low birth rates. We are at rates below, and very timely to have some of these articles and the stories from Marin City here. We are below when we came out of the Great Depression, and we're about half what we were during following World War II in the growth years. Okay, our total fertility rate is less than what is required to maintain our population. Okay, that's number one. Number two is we're currently a net migration out state by way of population. We've been net migration out in other years, but when it was for kids, it was always offset by net in from international migration. We don't have that right now. Okay, so net migration out to other states for our kids is we've had growth years and we've had net migration in, net migration out situations, but we've not felt the net migration out because of the net migration in from out of the country. Okay, and we don't have that right now. We still have quite a bit of new growth coming into the state, but not in school-age kids. They're in young professionals with degrees, and they're coming in for 6-figure jobs. I mean, they're moving here with the offer in hand kind of thing. They're not coming searching for them, right? Now, the hope is they stay here, have a family, and we'll see some kids, but probably not in most of our careers. We're going to be dealing with the funding. Okay, ADA provisions that we put in place during the pandemic to mitigate the dramatic loss in ADA. To hear some people, the state talk, they expire. They don't actually expire. Those were permanent changes that we made, but they become less useful on July 1. This year, the 3-year average, which is 80% of the districts right now are using the new provision of 3-year averaging. This year, that 3-year average has a pre-pandemic year in it of data. So it's still advantageous. Starting July 1, as the rolling average moves forward, it only has pandemic and post-pandemic data in it. So it drops quite a bit. And so most districts will revert back automatically to greater of current year or prior year. They won't, the 3-year averaging won't be helpful to them. Okay. And we have our one-time pandemic funds, escrow 3 is the large one that are expiring in September. And all of you, I'm sure, have those discussions because if you've got staff tied to them, you already how to make those decisions. Okay. We also have a challenge, and that is the governor said basically I'm holding schools and colleges harmless. That was the message to everybody, right? But at the local level, because of declining enrollment and other factors, you're going to be feeling the pinch. A COLA, any COLA that's less than 4.5% to 5%, you're going to feel a cut locally because your fixed costs go up by 4.5% to 5% year over year with nothing else. You just stay in bed and not even get out, and they're going to go up by 4.5% to 5%. Step and column, utility costs. Wait till you see your health insurance premiums. And more importantly, wait till you see your liability premiums, which are per ADA. If you think they're high now, you wait till the new rates come in. And most of you are being exposed to a special assessment due to AB 218 already. Some of you, that's in the $30 to $40 per ADA range, so not bad. But that number is likely to double next year and double the year after. Because in the 218 settlements and litigation and judgment world, we've taken care of most of the cases that are insured. So we now can quantify those numbers. What districts are being exposed to now are whether they're underinsured or uninsured for claims from 30 years ago, right? That they can't defend. There's nobody around except probably the perpetrator, right? Still sitting in prison. All right. Nothing bad news. Planning considerations. Now's the time to update your MYPs. You just did them all at first interim. So for the CBOs in the room, you should have already factored all this into a new MYP. Now is not the time to have one MYP. Okay, you should have 3 MYPs or more scenarios. If you are comfortable using the governor's estimates as midway point, great. But then do one that is worst case. So take $90 per kid out of it. That's the risk on the revenue, right? And a best case, up the COLA. Maybe make it 1%. I don't think we're going to hit 1%, but maybe make it 1%. Now you've got a range to have a conversation around the cabinet table, conversation in the boardroom about, and do some plans related to each of those ranges. Okay. That way you are not locked into one thing. You know that when X changes, and as a CBO, you come back to the cabinet table and you share that change. You've already thought through what our response to that would be locally. That will be fine. That's why we have reserves and so on. Okay. And speaking of reserves, now's the time to be boosting reserves, not spending reserves. Now's the time to be boosting your cash holdings because the next tool the state will use are cash deferrals or apportionment deferrals. Okay, they didn't give us any deferrals. Our estimate is that they can do about $15 billion worth of Prop 98 deferrals without hurting anyone. After that, it starts to get a little tight. Okay, and I know in this county here's county treasurer looks the other way and does some legally questionable things to borrow from each other without really borrowing from each other. You guys are the top of the state in how he does that, but it's helpful to all of you, right? So I just be quiet and leave it alone. until the IRS or somebody comes after you, right, puts you in jail, then you can call. All right, revenue risks of 15 billion to 100, of the 15 billion or that $100 per ADA that I talked about earlier. The numbers really, because of the spike clause in Prop 98, the number is really between $80 and $90 in that 100. I meant to change that this morning before I sent this to Bree. Ensure your position control is accurate and timely kept up, because you may have some position decisions you need to make in the next couple of weeks. What we know for sure in everything I've just shared with you, the only thing I've shared with you, everything I've shared with you, the only thing that will still be, or that is true come June, is the numbers will all be different. Okay. We don't really have a good sense from the legislature of how they're reacting to some of this. Number one, we have change in leadership coming in the Senate in a couple weeks, right? You all know that because McGuire represents you, and that's a nice move. He will change the chairs of the various committees. So on the budget side, all those hearings will be delayed. So we will start to hear from the Assembly and their reaction based on their questions that they ask us in hearings. It probably will be delayed before we hear that same thing from the Senate. Okay. And then I remind you all that in those cloudy storm clouds, there's always a silver lining. So you have to take advantage of storm clouds. If this is one of those times, now is a good time to think about what programs do we have that everybody thinks is so wonderful, but when we actually look at the data, we're not getting a return for students. Now is the time you use these as you use this condition as an excuse to maybe start to make some changes. Okay, whatever the case may be for you. All right.
Mike, thank you so much. I very much appreciate that. I don't see any questions in the chat that I'm able to access. I'm going to assume that original one that was in there before I joined is probably asking about whether or not we're gonna have this available for us, the presentation. And I just want to remind everybody that this recording and the presentation will be posted to our website, and we'll send out links to everyone so that you can access it. And other than that, I just wanted to quickly also mention, we had a discussion at our DBO meeting last week about foundations and Prop 28. And just so you're all aware, we are having legal look into how foundations relate to Prop 28 in this particular county. So that is something we're looking into for you.
So a couple things on Prop 28. So the issue of private funds. The legislature had an opportunity to resolve this issue and provided some clarifying language last June, and they chose not to do so. The proponents of this bill said it was never, the proponents of this initiative said it was never, in testimony, said it was never their intent to eliminate private funding for arts and music in our schools, and that should make some sense, right? I mean, they were looking for enhancing arts and music in the schools, so why would they eliminate what has historically been an enormous private investment? But in so doing, they also chose to leave in place without further clarification the supplant versus supplement, or I should say backward, I should say the other way, supplement versus supplant language that's in the initiative. The legislature, we wrote a historical definition of that and put that language in front of them that would have provided clarity, and they chose not to address the issue. You read statute SB 1, was Trailer Bill 115 last year, then the arts and music block grant is 114. I may have the two backwards. It's either 114 or 115. Whatever was not the funding trailer bill is the Prop 28 trailer bill. You'll see just the simple language. We have long held definitions of supplement and supplant. And we were hoping they would just adopt that as a matter of clarity. They chose not to. So it leaves it, frankly, for each of you to define. Don't do it blindly. Have a conversation with your auditors, because that's who will be looking at it, right? And work through that with them. What I can tell you is Prop 28 has no maintenance of effort in it, language in it. So just because you do X this year doesn't mean you have to do X next year. Okay? And in fact, Prop 28, it was on my slides, but I didn't bring it out, drops, the funding drops. Which is all the more reason for the private investment. So can you just go back? There we go. Oop, there it was. I skipped over it, but Prop 28 for next year, because it's a factor of Prop 98. It's a percentage of Prop 98. It's estimated at 931, which is down about $6.5 million. Not a big drop, but it's a drop. And that will result in a drop in funding. Remember, this is these funds are allocated out by school site. Some of you, when you see the list of schools and what they get, are going to be a little shocked because we have some charter schools that have like 15,000 kids in one school site. Right, just the way they report the data, they will get the bulk of Prop 98. So not probably what people thought was going to happen, especially the proponents really unified. They're a big supporter of charter schools, so that's fine. Nothing wrong with charter schools, but the way they wrote the bill lacked a full understanding of the mechanics, right? So this is right here is a reason for private investment, because you, in theory, should be able to use that private investment. If you're spending, let's just say you're getting 900,000 and it's going to drop to, well, let's just start doing math. Let's just say you're getting 906,000 right now as a school district, and it's going to drop to 900,000. You need to have the ability, right, to sustain your program, or ideally you'd want to sustain your program and you'd want to turn to your private partners for the $6 million, right? So, again, because the legislature failed to address it, my suggestions be thoughtful, but you do it locally, check with your auditors, make sure that they're in agreement, and then move forward, spend money on kids like it's intended.
Mike, we have another question from the chat, from Reed School District asking, is there anything in the governor's budget that community funded districts should be paying close attention to?
So for the, and then, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't believe this applies to you. You're not an excess tax county, right? For ERAF, or are you? Okay, so yes.
We are.
The governor proposes a change to the ERAF allocation that would provide clarity that it does include charter schools. And then in exchange for that, would be proposing to fix the current mess with ERAF for excess tax counties. What that really means for you locally, I don't know. We'll have to see with the trailer bill when it comes out this week, how it mechanically, how it works. This is a way overdue fix, but there's some trade-offs in it, i.e. the clarity for charter schools, which I think is overdue. Some community funded districts pay ERAF to their charter schools, and some fight about it. And so because of the gray area there. Nothing else I can think of other than if you're already in basic aid, the low COLA, and especially if you're declining the low COLA and declining, you're just going to put it farther in basic aid. Just the dynamic of it. But ERAF, the revisions to ERAF would have an impact. Or could have an impact. Yeah. Other questions?
Does anyone want the mic? All right.
Really?
Well, there's nothing else.
Made me leave Southern California before the sun was up this morning.
There's nothing else online in the chat, but I just want to say thank you so much, Mike, for coming and talking to us and providing us with such information.
Very welcome.